Welcome to the Law Firm Growth Podcast, where we share the latest tips, tactics, and strategies for scaling your practice from the top experts in the world of growing law firms. Are you ready to take your practice to the next level? Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Law Firm Growth Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jan Roos, and I am super excited about today's episode. So I'm sitting here today with Mike Chastaine, and Mike has an absolutely fascinating story. So Mike is a seven-figure firm owner. Very rare for us to find also a seven-figure firm seller. And is now also helping other law firms out with consulting. It is his new path after since he sold his firm. He had to find something to do. MC Consulting. So Mike, thank you so much for making onto the show.
Oh, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, awesome. So I actually wanted to start off in a bit of an unconventional way. So we were talking a little bit on the pre-call about your situation. And for anyone who is thinking about going the path to selling their law firm, what does it look like, 9 months and change after the sale for your day-to-day these days?
Well, for me, I had a criminal defense firm that I sold, and I couldn't just walk away. I had a number of clients that, had hired me specifically to do their trials. So I had 3 jury trials that I had to do before this year, so I went from basically being the owner to an employee and with an up-counsel position so I could have my name on the door. But I still had to do the work for many, many months. And I was commuting back and forth from Sacramento, California to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my house is, go do the trial and then, come back home and do things by way of Zoom. So, after 9 months, I'm down to one case that was supposed to be done, but it got kicked to next year. Nothing I could do about that. And so now I work, as far as the firm goes, basically, I go through all of their analytics. I go through all of their data, all their numbers for revenue. And then I also work with the other lawyers on staffing cases, strategic approaches of what should be done and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So
awesome.
It's about 5 to 8 hours a week at this point.
And that's like the nugget I was looking for too, because it's awesome. And it's kind of funny. We've had some previous guests on the show that it just, it's kind of interesting. I was also saying this in the pre-chat. It's like a lot of people kind of think of the 7-figure firm as the finish line. But in reality, if you ever want to get to the situation where you're out of it, selling it is not an easy thing either. We had previous guests on the show, Roy Ginsburg, talking about, the difficulty of selling the firm. So I just want everyone who's listening to this to appreciate how rare of a situation we have with somebody who's not only made it to that first finish line of getting the 7-figure practice, but also exiting it and getting to the point where, it's a 5 to 8 hour work week too, which is fantastic. But okay, so I wanted to do a little bit of kind of a flash forward to the beginning, but let's bring it all back, man. So I think let's talk about how you ended up getting to starting the firm in the first place, and then get into a little bit of the journey. I mean, why'd you start a criminal firm in the first place?
Well, I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And at that time in 1985, the way to get into the courtroom was either be a DA or a public defender. I mean, at the time I had hair down the middle of my back. No DA's office was going to be interested. So I applied to every public defender's office in Northern California and got very fortunate, got hired in the Santa Clara public defender's office. I stayed there for 17 years until the Bay Area just got kind of crazy with the .com boom and everything. So I've got 3 daughters. My wife, my 3 daughters, and I all moved to Sacramento, and I joined a criminal defense firm there. By the time I had been at the PD's office for a few years, I realized that was my calling. I loved being in trial. I had a lot of good success. I was doing really heavy cases, but, was having pretty good success with those. After a few years with this firm, it just became clear that our paths were going to go a different way. And so it took me about 9 months to actually separate, to kind of figure out everything I needed to do to open my own practice. And then that's what I did. The downside was, while I was a very good lawyer and I'd had great mentors in that, I'd never had a business mentor.
Right.
And so I just kind of rambled around doing what everybody else seemed to be doing. And, spending many nights staring at the ceiling, wonder how I was going to pay the rent.
Yeah.
So after a number of years of doing that, I finally got sick of it. And I went out and I found mentors to teach me how to run a business. And that's when everything really changed. I started, collecting data, doing the things that needed to be done to make it run like a business. Not, I stopped thinking of it as a law firm. I started thinking of it as a business that provided legal services.
Right.
And, then it was just a steady, increase in revenue every single year, got to, $1 million and have been very consistent at that level, bouncing around there, with 3 lawyers, no more than 3 lawyers we were doing that. So,
okay, that's super interesting. And I didn't know that was kind of the size of the team, but it's really one of the things I want to kind of double click on a little bit is the solo part of that, right? Because I feel like there's so many people who end up in the solo. It's almost I've called this the referral roller coaster. I've called it the solo treadmill before, but a lot of the times, and that's just kind of the nature of legal services. Like you're billing enough per hour where you can be driving car with 3 flat tires and still be getting where you want to be. But when you want to really kind of plug those holes, it's not the hard, well, it's a lucrative service business, so you can really start making some damage on that. For anyone who might be in a similar position in the audience, what were kind of the things that were like, did you have like a final straw moment of when you decided I gotta finally hire somebody? I'm finally done with this solo life. Like what kind of triggered you to make that decision?
Well, the first, so I had gone through iterations of having lawyers work for me, and that worked okay. But the real change for me was when I went out and hired a bookkeeper.
Interesting.
And I took basically 10 hours of work off of my plate, which I absolutely hated and did, a pretty poor job on, and sucked it up to free up that time. And then, when I realized the math was, if I was freeing up 10 hours of my week, and I only billed a couple of those hours, I was, 3 times paying for that bookkeeper and taking all that stress off of my desk. Once I started figuring out that math, realizing that everything I took off my plate gave me the option of billing more hours, then I went from there to a full-time phone person, and then bringing in a lawyer. But the lawyer was last. It was the support that really changed things for me.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what led to the decision to go for the bookkeeper? Was it just like your most hated position, or like did you have some advice to point you in that direction first?
Well, so yeah, I had a mentor that I was just starting out with, and he was going over with me, what was I doing and how was I spending my time? And he's like, why are you doing this? You're not doing a very good job. Let's be honest about it. And you don't like it. And it's just, sucking your life away. So that made it was surprising. I would not have expected that would have made that big of a difference, but it did. The stress of having a trust account, and making sure that was spot on all the time. I mean, as a criminal defense lawyer, the reality is the only way you get disbarred is if you commit a crime or you screw around with your trust fund.
Right.
And so, making sure that was to the penny, that was a huge relief for me. And then things started to going forward. And then the next big step from there was reading Profit First. I actually met Mike Michalowicz, read his book, Profit First, changed my entire accounting system, and we have made a profit from that point forward. So that was a huge change too.
Okay, that's awesome. And I want to kind of hone in on that too, because it's like there's almost a couple different levels to that. So there's obviously like, the time on the clock. If you want to talk about the hours that you save, that's one. It's an immediate gain right there. For anyone in the audience who's considering this, and it's a law firm growth podcast. I don't know if you're listening, why you're listening to this if you're not an attorney, but there's very few professionals that you would not get an arbitrage on going hour for hour for. So that's definitely another thing to kind of keep in mind. But I think the last and maybe the most important thing, it's like I think people, especially at the solo stage, they think about things in terms of time. But the reality is there's also the whole dimension of like energy that people want to wait for. It's like you have the situation where you're like, damn, I'd love to get through this IOLTA stuff, but if I end up having, I don't want to get disbarred for it. Like that's never something that you can shut off until you're able to fully delegate that to somebody else, which is, that's awesome. And then like, as far as getting that stuff too, I mean, you're probably in a pretty good shape. And I actually haven't had Mike on the podcast yet, but I'm actually a pretty good fan of his book. I actually just read Clockwork about 2 weeks ago, which is kind of funny, the new revised edition. So I'm sort of familiar with the thing, but tell me a little bit more about the Profit First stuff. Like, how did that end up? What was the situation before you ended up encountering that book, and how did it affect your growth pattern?
What it did is by using the Profit First system, basically I wound up opening 6 accounts. I think I had an operating account, a profit account, a tax account, a payroll account, a holding account, and a client expense account. I had all of those accounts. I just went to the bank and I said, I need all these accounts and I don't want you to charge me anything for it. And I got them to do that. And then what that allowed me to do is to see exactly where I was, as opposed to having all this money sitting in an operating account, right? And then of course there's the trust account, but I always saw that as totally separate. But if you have a whole bunch of money sitting in your operating account, your gut reaction to think is, well, I'm fat and happy, and here I can go spend and go buy some new Macs. But if you have it all divided out, you have your profit account, you have your tax account, so Uncle Sam's getting taken care of. You got money set aside for a rainy day, and I can tell you a story about why that's so critical. Then you have a much more realistic viewpoint on where you stand at any given moment. And I always kept my operating account really thin. I wanted to always feel a little bit poor so that I didn't go out. I always thought twice about making any major purchases.
I gotcha. I'm definitely going to ask you about that rainy day story too. That's too enticing to pass up.
Yeah. Well, so what had happened is because I was running that account, I opened up what I called a holding account, which is just a rainy day fund, a savings account. And I built it up to about $100,000. For those unexpected bills. And by having that money, like, we were able to do a marketing campaign that no other lawyer in Sacramento could do, because we had the cash and nobody in our situation did. Anyway, I have $100,000 sitting in it. March of 2020 shows up. So we go into COVID, right? All of a sudden, the phone's not ringing. No one's going to court. Even on the trust fund stuff, we really can't work on it because nobody's going to court. And I burnt through all but about $500 of that $100,000 to keep everything running. I didn't have to borrow a penny. That was the key, is I didn't have to borrow a penny to do that. And then, within, 5 or 6 months, we got our PPP loan. That really helped. And then when we were able to, get back and adjust to what was really going on, and then we doubled down on our advertising and raised our rates. We did all of that, and all of a sudden we were, back on course. Less clients, more money. It worked out really well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then, having that money in the how do you think that was, well, I mean, I can imagine how that would be super helpful, because, I'm guessing you didn't have to let anyone go, and you were in a position to, you didn't get knocked down below zero. Like, you were able to build up from, right when the money ended up coming in. You could spring right into action. You didn't have to hire people, warm up. You were ready to go once that loan came in.
Exactly. I mean, we did let a law clerk go because things got really slow. We had a lawyer leave, and we just didn't replace them until things picked up. And the other thing that was interesting, and this has to do with having the data of your firm and knowing where your firm is at any point. We know what every practice area that we do, generates. And we had a very robust DUI practice. Well, during COVID, it was not profitable anymore. And so we just completely let it go. When that lawyer left, that was what he did. He did DUIs. We let him go. We let the paralegal that was doing the DUIs go. We got rid of a huge part of our marketing budget because DUIs are expensive to market for. And then we just focused on the more serious cases. And again, raised our rates, which always seemed to be the key. And, we got right back on our feet.
Okay, that's awesome. So I want to kind of bring it back to those early days. So basically, the profit first accounts gave you a good level of analytics. And I want to say, as far as the situation with hiring a bookkeeper, that first hire is super tough. Was there anything that you had to go through mentally to go through that? And is there anything that you might want to, warn somebody who's in a similar situation? Like, what's stopping people from making that first hire?
I think it's a control thing for many people. They don't want to let, take their finger off the button, I guess. I never did. I never took my finger off the button. I saw everything that she did. I look at my P&L every day. I look at the bank account every day. I'm just not doing all the entries. So my review of that takes, a minute, and then I'm done. Take a look. If the numbers look the way they're supposed to look, boom, I'm good for the day. But I think it was scary. It was scary for me. It was, there were months where, I would have to basically pay this bill rather than that bill. And so adding another fixed cost was scary. But I also understood that if I didn't do something different, I was just going to keep getting the same thing. I couldn't work more. That was the problem. It's not an hour problem. You hit it right in the nose. It's an energy problem. At some point you just are out of juice, and it's like, I'm worthless. So it's time to go home. So yeah, but it's scary. It can be very scary for sure.
I also think it's probably easy that like, well, a little bit easier. It's never like super easy, but like, you didn't have to jump into full time. I think a lot of people, and again, I think there's well-meaning advice in this, but a lot of times people that suggest having an attorney as the first hire people have. And like that's crazy sometimes because the amount of a part-time 10 hours a week bookkeeper versus something else, I think you can get a taste of what it looks like for a lot without, risking the the existential health of the law firm by making kind of a smaller hop. But no, I think that's awesome too. And just for anyone who's kind of in a similar space too, it's just one of those things, I hear it every single time when people are talking about their stories, just like, I wish I made that first hire sooner. So, there's obviously a lot of mental stuff to kind of go, and it's different for every person, but no, it's always kind of good to have the example there. Okay, so I want to also transition to basically talking about that first attorney hire. So I know, kind of to speak for the invisible devil's advocate, you're a litigation guy, you're a trial guy. Like a lot of times people think, hey, look, I got the star power. People are hiring for me. How the heck do I hire another attorney when that's kind of the situation? So was there anything you had to change when you brought that other person on? Or, whether it be it marketing processes, like how you're managing things internally, like what did you have to change to make sure that you were able to kind of keep that service level consistent?
That's a good question. So I have to step back a little bit. My biggest problem at the point that I hired a lawyer was cash flow. I just have a good month. When you're doing bigger cases, higher end cases, you don't get that many of them. So I might have a month and I might, get 2 cases, and the next month I might not get any. So the strategy that I used to deal with this cash flow problem was to open up a DUI practice. I didn't do DUIs prior to that. And so I hired a lawyer specifically for that who had a lot of experience doing DUIs, and we tried to do a whole value thing. What my point was is that I hired someone not to replace me or not to do what I was doing, but to handle a very specific part of the practice that I didn't want to do. Now, the idea would eventually, hopefully some of it would rub off on them and they could start doing higher end cases. And then my job at the intake, as we started moving them into that position, was to sell them to the client. They came in for me, but I would always sell the team. Because even in the last few years, I didn't generally go to pre-trials and arraignments and stuff like that, if I could avoid it. Because one, I was expensive. It was cheaper to send an associate for the client. And two, I've probably done 10,000 arraignments, over 37 years. I don't know. I've done, I don't need to do another arraignment. So I've been doing that for a number of years. And then the other thing that I would do with these lawyers is I would let them sit second chair during my trials. I try not to try trials without a second person. Sometimes it's a paralegal, but I prefer it to be a lawyer so they can actually see how I do things, and then they can start to develop their own style.
Okay, interesting. And as far as where you went for this first attorney hire, was this somebody a little bit more green, or did you go experience? And like, what was kind of led into the decision for who you ended up making that first hire?
The person that we hired hadn't been a lawyer in maybe 4 or 5 years, but she had worked for a guy that all he did was DUI. So, I felt her level of experience was pretty high. So I would say she was intermediate. My preference after that was to hire people right out of law school and teach them the way we do things, right. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. At least I didn't have to break them of bad habits. We have one lawyer with us that's been with us for a number of years, got her right out of law school. She went to Georgetown. She's excellent. And the only struggle for her has been just getting her into trial because of COVID. It was really hard to get out on a misdemeanor trial. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as far as because that actually, I'm surprised that it was a different practice area because and as far as it looks like the strategy played out as far as this kind of making things work and bringing up for the higher value stuff. But did you have to change anything else on the business? And actually, this is a question I should have asked a few ones back. Like, what did your marketing situation look like at that point? How are you bringing cases into the firm?
Well, before I got, someone to help me out with all of this, I was basically living on referrals and appointed cases, which, I was glad I had those appointed cases, but man, I was losing money on them. It just was helping, bring some cash in. This sort of boils back down to knowing what your data is and figuring out who are your clients. So when I opened up my firm, instead of moving to Sacramento, where every lawyer lives, right, or has a practice, we moved out to a town about 30 miles east called Gold River. And we opened our practice there, where we instantly were on the first page of Google if you were in that area. And then we focused on basically this corridor that ran north and south for the client. So we didn't look for clients in Sacramento. We looked for the clients that were geographically close to us so we could market to them or we could SEO to them really easily. And that really made a big difference. The other thing we did is we did do jail mail for quite a while. And for the DUI practice, that was worthwhile. And then the final thing is I wrote books. I've written, I wrote a DUI book, a DV book, a general criminal book, a sex book, and they're very informational, but they are marketing material, right? We give those to clients when they show up. So that, that's very valuable too.
Yeah. So you really like to kind of take advantage of this unexploited, almost kind of like a geographical niche. And then it seems like you invested pretty heavily in the branding stuff with like the books, and that all ended up being. And did you ever go into, was it mostly the SEO stuff, or did you guys ever get into the billboard ads or the radio stuff, or beyond the jail mail?
I actually had a radio show for almost 4 years.
Really?
Yeah, I would do a Monday morning radio show for an hour on a very, very small station. But that was part of the branding issue. And, and then we just started doing Facebook Live. Instead of doing it on the radio, we did Facebook Live for a while. So you're right, branding, matters, and having a somewhat unusual name, but not impossible to remember, has helped, because people remember the name. And so that's been good. And then, there's just a function of doing it for a long time. I mean, I have to say, I was in Sacramento. I was in San Jose for almost 17 years. I've been in Sacramento for 20 years. Right. So, there's just some value in that.
Okay, gotcha. And then as far as kind of like, to get this back to kind of get some timelines on this. So we had solo for a couple of years. First attorney hire was what, a couple of years in?
Yeah, I brought in a guy who subsequently left and has remained a good friend. But I brought in a lawyer and a paralegal at the same time and just tried to grind out more work. But our big mistake was, or my big mistake was, is we weren't charging enough. Yeah. It just was as simple as that. We just weren't charging enough. So it was paycheck to paycheck for a long time. And then I gutted everybody. Everybody left. I was totally by myself again for about a year and a half. And then, then I brought in the bookkeeper, and then I brought in basically a phone person who was also the office manager, if you will. She was doing a lot of that stuff for me. And then it wasn't until later that I started bringing in paralegals. And then, I brought in a lawyer, and then I brought in a paralegal to support both of us.
Okay. Let's definitely talk about raising rates too, because I think this is one of the most underrated levers in business, but it's also one of the hardest ones to do. So can you talk about what ended up leading the decision and what it was like to go through that and how it felt after you ended up raising your rates?
Well, I will have to say, every time I've raised my rates, the phone rings more.
Interesting.
I don't think that this is unique to criminal defense lawyers, but people like to have the best criminal defense lawyer they can get. The kind of work we do, people are looking at going to prison for the rest of their lives in many cases. So they want the best person on their team, and they don't seem to be too concerned about what the hourly rate is or whatever. It's really, what do they have? What can they afford? Can they access the kind of money that they need to access to get us on board? And every time we've done it, as I say, it's just funny. The phone rings more. People, it doesn't scare them away. It really doesn't.
Yeah. Because it's kind of funny. I think a lot of the invisible voice in people's head when they're considering this is they're thinking to some, Econ 101 cost volume curve. And they're like, well, certainly I could raise my rates, but, of course, the volume is going to go down. And it's weird too, because it's I think, I think this was from Influenced by Cialdini. I think it's a lot of people associate price with higher quality. I'm sure there's people who don't end up improving their quality, which is probably to the detriment of anyone in the market. But I think the other thing too is that when you have the situation where you're making more profit, where did that go when you're scaling the business? You're probably having more time to more money to invest in better staff, or even if you don't change the staff, you have more time to focus on the cases that you do have. It's there's nothing worse in the world. There's nothing worse than a broke lawyer and what they're actually able to fulfill in their client, right?
Right. No question about it. Having a full staff. So, we have 8 employees, 3 lawyers, including myself at this point, although I'm not doing much in the way of billables, but 3 lawyers are working on getting another one in. We have a controller. This is in-house. We have a person who does all our phone work. So, that's all she does is the phone work, right? Mm-hmm. It's really critical that every phone call gets followed up on and every interview gets, reviewed and followed up on. If they didn't hire, we're gonna be talking to you in a couple of days to see if we can still help. Getting the people to show up to the appointment, setting the appointments, all of that scripted out. And then we have a paralegal, and then we have a guy who actually crunches all of our numbers so that I get a report every single day in Mexico. And, compared to American rates, he's very inexpensive. He does a great job. And within minutes, I can pretty much answer any question you have about the firm over the last, what's our best month? What quarters aren't as good? How is our leads doing versus how they did, a year ago or 2 years ago? I mean, that's really important data when you're trying to decide where am I going to spend my hard-earned money on marketing or practice areas.
Yeah. And kind of going on the metric stuff too, because I think, this is a theme ever since you ended up getting to the profit first stuff. So obviously we have money in the bank account as a key metric, but what are the other, key performance indicators that you like, if you could, let us into 2 or 3 of the top metrics that you're looking at day to day to see, hey, we having a good week, we having a bad week right now.
Right. So there's past indicators, which is, what's your payroll to the percentage of your payroll to your revenue, what's the percentage of your marketing to your revenue, and what's your net to your revenue. Those are the 3 numbers that I look at on a regular basis. Those tell me how we have done. How we are going to do is what I'm looking at is how many leads are coming in, how many are setting for appointment, well, how many are qualified for our services, how many set appointments, how many show up, and how many hires. That's telling me what our future revenue is going to be. And if any of those numbers changes in any, statistically significant way, I want to know why. And sometimes it's really simple. Sometimes people get off script. Sometimes it's just a bad week, but over, at least a month, those things should level out. Our leads should be pretty consistent month to month to month. Our stats should be consistent. And if they're not, I want to know why. And then we try to address it so that we don't get too far behind the 8 ball. That's the problem, right? Is if you don't pay attention, all of a sudden it's 6 months and you're wondering where'd all your money go?
Yeah.
Right. I want to know, am I going to have a problem next month? And I can tell that by the analytics that I have this month.
Yeah, it's super funny. So this is something that's kind of coming up a lot recently because basically, this is something we talk about the importance of the front desk person. I think, both in talking about in this context and the fact that it was the second person that you hired. I mean, it's obviously like a super important thing. And every single time we've had to look at this stuff internally, or we end up looking at this stuff for a client who's having issues with this, you can always point to some sort of a process not being followed when it comes to this. And it's like, it's very easy for people. It's like, oh yeah, well, hey, look, it's back to school. No one's picking up, or man, I don't know, this, market's really tough here or something like that. But it's like, look, if you do the work, it works almost every single time. And, I'm surprised we have, I asked this earlier, but I mean, you're a big operations guy. So how do you think about getting process in place, training people, like that kind of things? Like, I mean, what's sort of your philosophy for getting people trained up and performing consistently outside of the metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's all about developing your scripts and your anticipated responses. So everyone in our firm answers the phone the same way. Everyone does an intake, the initial phone intake, the same way. We have a sheet that they're required to fill it out, and it tells them all the questions to ask.
Yeah.
So if I get that sheet and that's not filled out, I go and say, well, why didn't this get filled out? What's the, what happened? And sometimes, things get sidetracked, right? The person on the phone's crying and you just don't get to some of the questions. That's what I want to know. Is this a unique problem, or are you just starting to not follow the script? The second part is trying to train on a pretty regular basis. Now that's been hard with the schedules that the lawyers have, but going over those numbers with everybody and reviewing the work that gets done. We even listen to some of the phone calls and go, are you staying on script? Are you doing what we're supposed to do? If you are, and the numbers are falling, then we need to start considering whether to change the script in some way. Mm-hmm. But if you're not following the script, then we have no way to A/B test, right? That's really what we're talking about is we do it this way, and we're going to make this single change and see if that affects things. And so the script works. I just tell you, I've been using the same script for about 5 years, and the scripts work.
Yeah.
And I see the problem happen. And even on the intake, when I sit down with a client or on the phone, I have a process that I'm supposed to go through, and I see my hire rate drop when I deviate from it. If I just stick to it, it works.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity too, I always like to ask this for different practice areas. Do you guys what's your benchmark for in terms of how many leads you get into that'll actually end up booking a consultation? What do you guys shoot for?
So we've been pretty consistent around 80 leads, and that turns into about 12 clients.
Okay.
So we've been running about a 40% higher rate, which has been real good. So what's that get us? About
24 on 80?
24, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, cool. So I'm trying to do the math on that. So yeah, it's like 35-ish% probably if I'm it's not
Yeah,
really
so
good.
of the 80 leads, we'll probably have 20% of them won't be qualified. They just won't be cases that we either do or in a jurisdiction that we do it in. So our SEO net maybe is a little bit wide. And it's funny, we get calls for, family law in Tennessee, every once in a while. They're like, thanks, but no. But and then from there, it's a matter of getting those appointments set and getting people to agree to come in, and then to get them to show up.
Yeah, the show rate. Well, I mean, it's kind of like if you're throwing out 25%, that's 24 consultations booked on 60. That's damn near 50%. That's pretty good. And like I'll say this too, just as far as what we've seen generally, and mostly in the estate planning space, 25 to 50 is usually 50 is incredible. So that's actually this was really good numbers. But yeah, I mean, like you said, it's the consistency and just applying stuff. I want anyone to think like it's funny because people will usually try to look at anything except for the process first, including people inside the firm too. So it's like, it's just one of these things I feel like, and it's such a powerful lever too, because when you have the situation where your front desk is booking, that empowers so much. Your dollar in marketing is going faster than somebody who's got a 10% book rate, and probably going better than somebody. But the other thing too is just kind of going back to that bedrock of the metrics. How can you tell whether anything's working unless you know what the standard is and what it was last week and what it is this week, right?
Exactly. No, that's the key. And the other thing that we have learned is the way the script is designed, we get a certain percentage of people who show up ready to hire, before they even meet us, because they are sold during the intake.
Right.
It gets mentioned. So if they call in with a sex case, it gets mentioned, I've written a book on how to survive being accused of a sex crime. So I have this book out there and we'll give that to you when you show up. And there isn't anybody else in our area that wrote a book, much less forum. So, it gives you that instant credibility, and a lot of people show up and they're just ready to hire. And then, so if she's not able to do that, I mean, I've had people come in and say, that gal that you get at the front desk, man, she's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm not so sure about, but she's great. Right. And I'm like, cool. That's exactly what I want to hear.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so I want to make sure we get to talk about this because I know we're getting a little late on time, but let's talk about the sale. So basically, how did that end up working out? So I know that it was finalized towards the end of last year, but who's the buyer? Did you sell to the partners? Did you have an outside buyer? What was kind of the situation that set that up? And just to kind of go back to the beginning for anyone who's listening, it's it is not easy to sell a law firm. So let's talk about that process a little bit.
Sure. So there was a long preparation period, and then a really good series of lucky things that happened, if I'm going to be honest about it. So I had gone back to my mentor and I told him I wanted to sell the firm. And we spent a couple hours going through all the matrix. Because I had all these numbers, I could justify exactly what you were going to do. If you bought my firm and you just did what I do, you could be almost guaranteed doing $1 million for your very first year. So, and I had the numbers to back all that up. And so we had contacted a broker, and we had thought about, contacting firms that might want to absorb us. But my wife said to me, she said, can you think of anybody that that might be interested? Why don't we go for the low hanging fruit? Mm-hmm. And I thought about it for a while, and I came up with one name, a guy that I didn't know on a personal level, but I knew by reputation. He was a public defender in Placer County, and I liked him, and I thought it had the potential of being a good fit. So I called him up and I just said, hey, Martin. Well, actually, I saw him in a parking lot on his way to court. And I said, hey, would you be interested in working for him? And he said, yeah, but I got to go give closing argument. I'll call you later. So he called me. We sat down. We had lunch. And I just kind of laid it out for him. I'm looking to sell this. I want someone who I know is good, that will, pick up the ball and continue to do what I've been doing with my support. And basically we hired him for 3 months to make sure it was a good fit. before we went through all of the pain of the sale. And once we knew that it was going to work, we had a lawyer draft up a contract for us, a business contract, that was neutral, and boom, the sale went through. So I got very lucky on that. I didn't have to go in the public market, but I let him buy it on time, and I had to stay for that was part of the contract, part of the deal. I have to stay at least on the business side of it to make sure that things work, because he had never run a business, and certainly not a law firm before.
Okay. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting too. I think in the broader business world, a lot of people think about that like it's an earnout or something like that too. But I mean, it seems this is kind of the interesting thing. Like whenever the topic of selling a business comes up, it's like when you get a business that's anyone would want to sell, actually running the thing isn't that hard. It's kind of the paradox, right? Like it's it's not easy. It's the easiest thing to keep doing, but it doesn't seem like it's killing you at the moment too, but that's kind of the reality.
Well, I'm very proud to say it really was turnkey. I mean, Martin came in, they made a few changes, but they didn't need to change anything. All the employees stayed, which I think is a good sign that we were paying everybody fairly. And I mean, literally he just, started running things and using his credit card as opposed to my credit card to pay for stuff. But, I think the question that you were alluding to is I didn't do this because I hated it. I still like doing trials. Yeah. I just want to go to court anymore, and I love Santa Fe. It's a great place, and there's other things that I want to do. So it wasn't a matter of, I can't do it anymore, or I don't want to do it anymore. I feel like, the last 3 trials I did. I had a client who stabbed a guy or shot a guy 9 times. He was acquitted. Mm-hmm. I had a guy charged with 11 counts of child molest. He was acquitted. So, I still feel like I'm at the top of my game. It's just, I'd like to bow out, before I'm not.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing too. It's like, it's kind of funny. I'm a big MMA fan, but it's like hard to find the people who have the opportunity to ride off and have a happy ending. Cause it's, I look at some of the greats, like only a handful of people do it. So many people saying it way too long. And that's what was last time we had Roy Ginsburg on the podcast. He said, for the most part, it's not going to be you closing out your files. It's going to be your wife or your kids after you end up passing away. The amount of people that end up dying at their desk, waiting for things to go is way too much. But, as far as a happy ending goes, it's awesome, man. You got a ton of life ahead of you. You're doing what you want, and any of the involvement that you have with the business is the stuff that you enjoy the most. So it's like, who wouldn't want to do that, right?
Right. No, I mean, this is the stuff that I'm teaching other firms now, and we apply it in our own sandbox. And we have just an example. I was looking at the numbers the other day, and there was a number that I didn't like, and I'm like, let's call our SEO guy. We got to figure out why that number is what it is, because it's dropped, and it shouldn't. So I'm doing for Chastain Jones the same thing I'm doing for other folks. It's just I know this one much more intimately.
Well, let's transition to that a little bit. So as far as the work that you've been doing with other firms, like what kind of people you've been working at, and like, what have been some of the situations that you've been able to help most in your opinion?
So I work with small and solo practitioners to help them do that transition from being a law firm owner to being a business owner. I mean, I think that's the mindset that you've got to break into and start thinking of your firm as being a separate entity. It's not you; it's a separate entity, and then all of a sudden doors open and you have options if you wanted to sell it, you could build it properly and sell it. But what I find is that where most people are struggling right from the get-go is their time management. And it goes back to the bookkeeper thing, right? They're doing all their own stuff and not giving themselves the opening to do things that bring in cash. Bookkeeping never brought a nickel into me. It just kept me from losing my bar card, right? It kept me from being sued. It's really important, but it didn't bring in a nickel. I needed to be out working, either bringing in clients or, going to court and doing my thing.
Right. And then so basically, as far as the people getting out, it's like, getting out of it and, people honestly trying to get on the goal to either sell or automate their business, right? It's kind of the same path, isn't it?
Actually, it is. If you can separate yourself out so that things get done without you being present, just like what Mike talks about in Clockwork, then you have the ability to multiply the revenue because it's not all based on the hours that you can put in. And you also have the freedom to spend time on the business. I mean, everything that we talk about, when I made this shift, I started putting a substantial period of time on working on the business. So so that it would become profitable, so I could review these numbers, so I could understand what was going on. And that's why I raised my rates, because I had fewer hours that I was going to bill, and I wanted to try to maintain that income.
Yeah. And you're not going to be working on the business when you're doing your books or taking out the trash too, which a lot of people don't realize. But that's awesome. And I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, and I want to be respectful of your time, Mike. But as far as any situations, like if you're open for clients, what's the best way for anyone who's listening to this that might be resonating that to get in touch?
Yeah, so the best way to get a hold of me, you can email me directly at mchastaine, that's CHASTAINE @gmail, or you can go to my website, MikeChastaine.com. It is being revamped, so if you go today, it may be a little different tomorrow, but functionally, there's a contact button, and it will explain, kind of the things that we're doing. And the people that we're working with. But those are the two easiest ways. And then what we do is I would set a 45-minute appointment, go over, what your situation is. Can I help you? And are you interested in working with me? And would this be a good fit? And if the answer to that is yes, then we'll come up with a game plan.
All right. That's awesome. And then as far as thank you again so much for taking the time, Mike, but it's for everyone else, I want to kind of bring it back to the beginning. You said when you started focusing on it, it started growing. And I think a lot of people get in their own way and try to make things too complicated. But, when you have this orientation towards the process, again, beginning with the end in mind, having these ways to make things and fix the gaps and know what you're doing from the metrics, right? Like such an important thing. I think it's been an awesome exploring your journey. And for anyone who's interested, for sure, we're going to have that in the show notes so you can reach out. But Mike, super appreciate the time. And for everybody else, I'll see you guys next Tuesday at 8 a.m. Eastern on the Law Firm Growth Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Growth Podcast. For show notes, free resources, and more, head on over to casefuel.com/podcast. Looking forward to catching up on the next episode.